Welcome to my channel. Today we uncover a chilling story from 37,000 feet above the Earth, where a single alarm, one shrill and unmistakable tone, marked the moment a crew realized they were out of time. This is not fiction. It is a true account of courage, confusion, and heartbreak aboard a Boeing 757 on what began as a clear and ordinary morning. The passengers boarded calmly, the engines roared to life, and the takeoff roll was smooth. But somewhere high over the Atlantic, with sunlight washing through the cockpit windows, a warning light blinked red. Then that sound filled the air. A noise every pilot trains to recognize, but one they pray they never hear. At first the captain thought it was a sensor glitch. The Boeing had been cruising perfectly for hours. The instruments were steady, fuel balanced, no sign of trouble. Then the second alarm followed, lower, harsher, vibrating through the cockpit walls. The first officer looked up, his voice tight. "That's not a system test." The captain's hand went to the overhead panel, silencing the first tone, but the second refused to stop. A red master caution illuminated above their head. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Something deep in the aircraft's body was bleeding power. Behind the locked cockpit door, 200 souls sat unaware, chatting, watching movies, and trusting that the men at the controls had everything under control. The radio crackled as the crew called air traffic control. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 718, we're experiencing multiple system failures." On the ground, the controller's tone hardened instantly. "Flight 718, Roger, confirm nature of emergency." But before the captain could reply, the alarm changed again. It wasn't just hydraulic pressure now. One of the engines had begun to surge. The aircraft lurched to the left, a deep metallic rumble vibrating through the floor. In the cabin, coffee spilled, a baby cried, and a flight attendant caught the armrest as turbulence shook the aisle. The smell of hot oil and ozone filled the air. Passengers turned their heads toward the cockpit door, wondering what could make a machine that massive shudder like that. Inside the cockpit, both pilots were sweating. The captain's voice was low, calm, but his eyes flicked rapidly across the panels. "We've lost fluid in System B. Left spoilers unresponsive. Engine 2 fluctuating." The co-pilot's hand hovered near the checklist. "Should I shut it down?" "Not yet," the captain said. "We might need thrust." But the gauges were falling fast, and then, with one final shriek, the master warning illuminated bright crimson across the flight deck. It wasn't a single system anymore. It was the core alarm, the one Boeing engineers designed to mean only one thing: fire. The word hit them like a punch. The fire warning bell filled the cockpit, echoing down the metal fuselage. The captain's voice hardened, clip. "Engine fire, engine 2. Pull the handle." The first officer's hands moved in perfect rhythm with training, pulling the red lever, cutting fuel, discharging extinguishers. The alarm didn't stop. The heat sensor lights continued to glow. "It's not going out," the captain said, eyes locked on the temperature gauge. Outside, smoke began to stream from the right engine, curling into the blue sky. The control tower's radar showed the 757 starting to descend. Controllers cleared every other aircraft from their path. "Flight 718, you are cleared direct to Halifax, runway 23. You are priority 1. Emergency services standing by." Down below, the passengers could see the ocean tilting through their windows. A quiet panic began to spread. The cabin crew moved briskly, trying to keep voices calm, but one look at the attendants' faces told the truth. They were scared too. In the jump seat behind the cockpit, a relief pilot watched the captain's hands tremble slightly as he tried to trim the aircraft. "We've lost right side hydraulics completely," he said. "We can't hold altitude." The co-pilot looked up. "What about gear? Maybe gravity drop, maybe not. Prepare for manual landing." The younger pilot swallowed hard. "At this weight." The captain met his eyes. "We don't have a choice." They began their descent through a thin layer of clouds. The right engine was dead, but its fire light still burned. The left engine groaned under full thrust. At 15,000 feet, the smoke alarm for the cargo bay joined the chorus, a third tone, hollow and distant. The relief pilot leaned forward, his voice sharp. "If it's spread to the hold, we won't make it to the coast." The captain's mind raced through procedures, calculating, hoping. Dump fuel. We lighten her, maybe we glide. They jettisoned what they could, a long stream of vapor trailing behind, glittering like a silver ribbon in the morning sun. The control tower's radar showed their altitude dropping too fast. "Flight 718, say souls on board." The captain's voice came back steady but tired. 203. Copy 203. In the tower, firefighters rolled engines toward the runway, paramedics lined the tarmac. The captain tightened his harness. "Flaps 3, gear down." But the co-pilot shook his head. "Gear indicators dead. We'll take what we've got." The nose pitched down as the clouds broke apart, revealing a thin strip of coastline ahead. The relief pilot whispered, "We're short. We're not going to reach it." The captain refused to accept that. "We'll reach it," he said, forcing the nose up slightly, trying to stretch the glide. The cockpit alarms wailed in protest. A red light blinked across the overhead, electrical failure imminent. The co-pilot reached for the circuit breakers, trying to keep just enough power to control the elevators. The passengers felt the cabin darken as lights flickered out. One woman gripped her husband's hand, whispering prayers through trembling lips. In the galley, a flight attendant strapped herself into her jump seat and whispered, "Please, just let us touch ground." At 6,000 feet, the cockpit was filled with the smell of smoke. The right engine's fire light still burned, but the sensor readings had gone wild. Either the engine was gone completely or the wiring had melted. The captain's eyes watered as he leaned forward. "We've lost the ailerons." "Then what's holding us?" "Luck," he said flatly. Through the haze of heat and smoke, he could see the runway lights flashing faintly in the distance. The control tower came through one last time. "Flight 718 winds calm. Runway 23 clear. Good luck." The captain smiled faintly. Luck accepted. As they descended through 3,000 feet, the aircraft began to roll to the right. The co-pilot fought the controls, using every ounce of muscle to keep the wings level. The fire alarm blared again, louder this time, distorted, as if the sound itself were screaming. "She's breaking apart," the relief pilot shouted. The captain gripped the yoke, voice steady even now. "Hold her. Hold her till the end." The ocean rushed up toward them, waves reflecting the fire from the dying engine. And then, for a brief moment, the alarms stopped. No noise. No vibration. Only silence. In that heartbeat of quiet, the captain looked at his crew and nodded once. They understood. The ground came up fast, the sea spray exploded against the windshield, and the Boeing 757 struck the water just short of the coast. Rescue teams reached the site minutes later. Miraculously, dozens survived. The captain was found still strapped in his seat, hands on the controls, his face calm, as though he had simply fallen asleep. Investigators later discovered the cause. A microscopic crack in a fuel line had ignited deep within the right engine, spreading flames through hydraulic lines and wiring. The alarms that filled the cockpit that morning had been the only warning the crew would ever receive. And when they heard them, it was already too late. In the years that followed, the story of Flight 718 became one of aviation's most haunting lessons, proof that even the most routine flights can turn catastrophic in the blink of an eye, and that courage often sounds like the voice of a pilot staying calm while the world burns around him. Thank you for watching this Mayday special. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real air disaster documentaries and cinematic aviation stories. Until next time, fly safe and keep your eyes on the skies. The ocean was calm that morning, glimmering beneath a pale sky streaked with high cirrus clouds. For the passengers of Flight 718, it was supposed to be a simple trip, a 4-hour hop across the coast aboard a Boeing 757, one of the most trusted aircraft in the skies. The flight attendants greeted each traveler with practiced smiles, the hum of engines rising into a steady rhythm as the jet pushed back from the gate. Families settled into their seats, a young couple shared earbuds, and a businessman in seat 14A loosened his tie, staring absently at the sunrise through his window. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Reynolds adjusted the autopilot settings while his first officer, Daniel Hayes, reviewed the flight path one final time. "Clear skies all the way," Hayes said with a grin. The captain smiled, his voice calm and confident. "Let's keep it that way." The 757 climbed gracefully, engines roaring as the city lights faded behind them. The aircraft leveled at 37,000 feet, slicing through the smooth, thin air with a gentle hum. Coffee brewed in the galley, passengers laughed softly over the murmur of the engines, and the captain leaned back in his seat, the faint light of the instruments reflecting off his face. It was the kind of morning every pilot dreams of, quiet, uneventful, predictable. But in aviation, peace is fragile, and it never lasts long. Almost an hour into the flight, something shifted. A faint vibration rippled through the deck, subtle, like a heartbeat gone irregular. The captain noticed it first, glancing at the engine gauges. Everything appeared normal, but the vibration persisted. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Hayes nodded. "Yeah. Just started." It was barely noticeable, but pilots are trained to sense the smallest anomalies. The captain reached for the overhead panel, scanning indicators for any hint of trouble. "No faults showing," he murmured. "Could be turbulence from another flight path." But the sky outside was empty, blue and endless. Minutes passed. The vibration grew stronger, joined by a faint metallic rattle beneath their feet. Then a sound pierced the calm. A single, shrill tone filled the cockpit. The master caution alarm. Both men froze, their training taking over instantly. "We've got a warning," Hayes said, his voice steady. He pressed the reset switch, silencing the tone, and looked to the engine display. "Hydraulic system B pressure dropping." The captain frowned. "That can't be right." They ran through the checklist, flipping switches, rerouting pump. The pressure kept falling. "Hydraulic fluid loss," the captain muttered. "Where's it going?" But the truth was far more terrifying. The leak wasn't in a system line. It was inside the right engine, and it was only the beginning. In the cabin, no one noticed yet. A flight attendant poured coffee, smiling as a little boy pointed out the window at the clouds. The sun reflected off the ocean below, peaceful and endless. Then, faintly, a new sound hummed through the floor, deeper, heavier. The flight attendant paused, her smile faltering. She turned toward the galley wall, where a small red light had just begun to blink. "Smoke detector, cargo bay," it read. She froze for half a second, then picked up the intercom. "Captain, we've got an indication down here." Up front, the tension in the cockpit deepened. The warning for the lower cargo bay flashed on the panel just as her call came through. "We see it," the captain said into the mic, his voice clipped. "We're running checks." Hayes opened the manual, fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through the fire suppression procedures. "It's showing in the aft compartment." "Deploy bottles 1 and 2, the captain ordered. Hayes pulled the handles, releasing extinguishant gas into the hold. The alarm silenced briefly, then came back louder. "It's not going out." Outside, a faint trail of smoke began to form from the underside of the fuselage, curling in the slipstream. Inside the cabin, passengers began to smell something, faintly acrid like burning wires. The attendants moved quickly, checking overhead bins, glancing at one another with eyes that said what none dared voice. In the cockpit, the alarms multiplied. The right side engine parameters were fluctuating now, N1 levels spiking, fuel flow uneven. The captain knew what that meant. A fire in the hold could ignite fuel lines routed through the right pylon. He toggled the switch. "Shut it down." Hayes hesitated. "That leaves us one engine over the Atlantic." "Shut it down." The sound of the right engine winding down filled the cockpit, a long mechanical sigh that faded into silence. For a moment, the plane felt weightless. The hum dropped to a single low drone from the remaining engine. Then, a new alarm. A deep, repeating chime that every pilot knows too well. The fire bell. It rang through the cockpit like a scream. Both men turned toward the engine fire light glowing crimson on the panel. Engine 2 fire. Confirm, Hayes said. The captain's face hardened. Confirmed. Pull the handle. The red lever snapped into place, cutting off fuel. Fire bottles 1 and 2 discharged, hissing through the duct lines. The alarm did not stop. She's still burning, Hayes shouted. The captain looked out the window. Far out on the right wing, a shimmer of heat distortion rippled through the air. Then a flash of orange. Flames, faint but visible. He grabbed the radio. Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 718, engine fire, descending to 15,000, request immediate vector to nearest airfield. The controller on the other end went cold. Flight 718, Roger, Halifax is nearest. Turn heading 085. You are priority 1. The captain's hand shook slightly as he adjusted the autopilot. Descending. The plane banked gently, its right wing dipping lower than normal. The passengers could see the ocean tilt through their windows. The smell of smoke grew stronger, seeping into the cabin. Flight attendants hurried down the aisles, calm but pale. Please remain seated, they said softly, we're experiencing a technical issue. But behind their calm tones, their eyes darted nervously toward the galley, where the red light still blinked. The descent began smoothly enough, but the fire refused to die. Every few seconds, the cockpit filled with the relentless wail of alarms. She's losing hydraulic pressure, Hayes said, gripping the yoke. We're down to manual. The controls grew heavier, the plane less responsive. Speed dropping, the captain murmured. Keep her level. The altimeter spun down. Passing 20,000. The heat readings were off the charts now. If the pylon goes, the captain said quietly, we lose the wing. Hayes didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Smoke began seeping into the cockpit, thin at first, then thicker. The relief pilot behind them coughed, covering his mouth with his sleeve. We're not going to hold altitude. The captain looked out at the horizon, the faint glint of coastline barely visible through haze. We'll hold as long as we can. He reached for the intercom, his voice steady even as alarms screamed in his ears. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have a small fire on board, but we are in control. We'll be landing shortly. Stay calm and follow crew instructions. He switched off the mic and whispered, God help us. Below, the rescue crews in Halifax were already scrambling. Runway 23 was cleared of all traffic. Fire engines rolled into position. In the tower, the supervisor leaned over the radar, watching the green blip flicker and drop. They're coming in fast, he said. The operator nodded, voice tight. Too fast. Back in the sky, the 757 systems were failing one by one. The navigation screen blinked off, replaced by static. The electrical bus failed, taking the cabin lights with it. In darkness, passengers held hands, whispering prayers as the jet shook violently. The captain reached over and grabbed Hayes's shoulder. Listen to me. We keep her steady. Flaps down, gear down if it'll go. We land her on the runway or the water, whatever's closest. Hayes nodded, jaw set, eyes glistening. As the shoreline came into view, so did the first sight of Halifax's emergency lights, red and white, blinking faintly through smoke and haze. They were close now. Too close. And the fire alarm kept ringing, each tone like a heartbeat counting down. The crew had no way to know, but deep inside the right wing, a structural spar was melting, seconds from failing. The world below moved slower now. The ocean shimmered gold, the city silent. In the cockpit there was no more fear, only focus. Speed 160, Hayes said softly. The captain nodded. Let's finish this. The sky had turned the color of molten steel as Flight 718 fell toward the horizon, its crippled engines trailing thin ribbons of smoke that caught the dying light of the sun. Inside the cockpit, everything was heat, alarms, and trembling metal. The smell of burning insulation filled the air, sharp and bitter, and each breath tasted like static. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Hayes said little now. There were no words left that mattered, only the rhythm of procedure and the ticking of seconds. They had trained for fire, for engine failure, for loss of hydraulics, but not for all of it at once. The Boeing 757 shuddered again, dropping 100 feet before stabilizing. Reynolds gritted his teeth, feeling the yoke fight him like a living thing. "Hold her steady," he muttered. Hayes nodded, sweat running down his temple, eyes fixed on the instruments. "Trying, sir. She doesn't want to fly." Outside, the right engine was a glowing wound. Flames licked from the nacelle, flashing along the wing's edge. The aluminum skin rippled from the heat, warping like wax under a candle. Hydraulic fluid hissed out, feeding the inferno. Smoke streamed into the slipstream and curled back across the fuselage, streaking it black. In the cabin, passengers could now see it clearly, the right engine engulfed, glowing orange in the late afternoon light. Gasps and muffled cries rippled through the rows. A flight attendant tried to calm them, her voice trembling through the intercom. "Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We are making a precautionary landing." But her tone betrayed what the words tried to hide. There was no such thing as precaution anymore. In the cockpit, Hayes scanned the gauges again. "Left engine steady at 94%, he said. "We've got partial control through alternate hydraulics." Reynolds barely heard him. His focus was on the horizon, the faint glimmer of Halifax runway lights still a ghostly thread in the haze. "We just have to make land," he said quietly. "After that, she's in the hands of gravity." The relief pilot in the jump seat coughed violently, smoke swirling around him. "We've got to open the outflow valve or we'll suffocate." "Not yet," Reynolds snapped. "If we open it, we'll feed the fire." He glanced at the oxygen gauge. Half a tank left. That would have to do. Then the cockpit went dark. The instrument lights flickered once, then failed completely, plunging the flight deck into shadow. "We just lost the main bus," Hayes said. Reynolds reached down and toggled the battery switch, but the displays only sputtered weakly to life. "We're on emergency power now," he said, voice steady. "No more restarts." The radio crackled, faint and distorted. "Flight 718 you're 5 miles, runway 23 static," swallowed the rest. "Say again, Halifax?" Reynolds shouted. Nothing. The signal was gone. Below them, the first stretch of ocean broke into view, its dark waves glowing faintly under the fire's reflection. The 757 was gliding now, its one remaining engine barely keeping altitude. The cockpit rattled, the airframe groaning with every gust. Hayes adjusted the trim. "We're heavy," he said. "She's dropping faster than the charts." Reynolds nodded, tightening his grip. "We can't dump any more fuel. Pressure's dead in the crossfeed. We ride her in." In the cabin, the fear had become tangible. Passengers clutched each other as the jet lurched and the cabin lights flickered. Somewhere near the back, a child screamed for his mother. The smell of smoke was everywhere now, seeping from the vents. The attendants moved methodically, checking belts, forcing calm into their shaking voices. One of them, a veteran of 20 years, paused by the galley door and looked toward the cockpit. Through the small crack of light around the doorframe, she could hear the alarms, unending, merciless. The altimeter wound down, 10,000 feet. Halifax appeared ahead through the windshield, just a smudge of lights across the dark coastline. Reynolds could see the reflection of emergency vehicles already racing down the runway, their sirens flashing red even from miles away. For a heartbeat, relief touched his face. "We're gonna make it," he whispered. But fate had other plans. At 8,000 feet, the right wing dipped suddenly. The aircraft rolled, the nose yawing hard to the right. "She's going!" Hayes yelled, fighting the controls. "The spars giving out." Reynolds forced the yoke left, muscles straining. "Hold her! We're losing lift." The Boeing trembled violently, alarms blaring again. Outside, a section of the right wing tore loose, flaming debris spiraling into the sea below. The 757 rolled further, nearly on its side, before Reynolds managed to level it just enough to keep the nose forward. "We've lost part of the flaps," Hayes said through clenched teeth. "We're coming in hot." The captain didn't answer. His mind had narrowed to one thing: distance. Each mile mattered. Every second of lift meant another chance. "Speed 180, he said. "We're fast but stable." Halifax control came through faintly on backup radio, barely audible through static. "Fire crews, standing by, runway clear, winds calm." Reynolds keyed the mic. "We'll try to make it to the runway. If not, we'll ditch before the shore." Hayes turned to him, eyes wide. "Ditching at this speed in this wind, we'll break apart." Reynolds glanced back, his voice low but steady. "Then let's not miss the runway." The shoreline loomed ahead now, a thin, dark line beneath the glow of the burning engine. Below them, fishermen on the coast looked up to see a streak of fire crossing the sky, descending fast. In the tower, controllers watched in silence as the radar dot blinked lower, slower. The flight supervisor whispered, "They're not gonna make it." At 5,000 feet, the cockpit was a furnace. The fire had eaten through insulation, the heat blistered the windows. Smoke filled their lungs. Reynolds pulled his oxygen mask tight, his voice muffled. "Landing checklist." Hayes forced a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Half the switches don't work anymore." "Then read what's left," the captain replied. Hayes recited the steps from memory, his voice trembling. "Flaps, manual override. Gear, gravity drop. Lights out. Crossfeed, disabled." Reynolds nodded once. "That'll have to do." As they broke through the final layer of cloud, the runway lights came into full view, a silver line stretching out into the dark. The captain could almost hear the sound of the trucks waiting below, the wail of distant sirens. "There she is," he said. "Runway in sight." Hayes gripped the yoke, knuckles white. "We're high." "Then take her down." The Boeing 757 began its final descent, smoke trailing like a comet. Inside the cabin, passengers wept openly, hands locked together, some whispering prayers, others staring in silent disbelief. The attendants braced themselves at their stations, eyes wet but unblinking. The youngest among them whispered a single line under her breath. "Let it be quick." Back in the cockpit, the ground rushed closer. The altitude callouts echoed mechanically. 500, 400, but the system voice was distorted, warping under failing power. 300. The captain pushed the nose slightly up. "Easy, easy, 200. Hayes's hand trembled on the throttle. "Speed 170. "Hold it steady," Reynolds said. The runway filled the windshield now, so close they could almost see the flashing lights of the fire trucks. And then, just as the wheels should have touched the ground, the right engine exploded. The fire reached the fuel tank, a white-hot flash that tore through the wing root. The aircraft lurched violently, rolling right again, the nose dipping as flames engulfed the fuselage. Hayes screamed, "We've lost the wing." Reynolds yanked the yoke back with everything he had, his voice raw. "Hold her." The plane slammed into the tarmac tail first, the impact splitting the fuselage in two. Sparks and debris rained across the runway as the jet skidded sideways, metal shrieking against concrete. Inside, the cabin tore apart, seats breaking free, windows shattering. The forward section slid nearly half a mile before coming to rest in a cloud of smoke and fire. For a few seconds there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the crackle of burning fuel and the hiss of cooling metal. Then, faintly, a voice came from the wreckage, a child crying. Firefighters were already running, spraying foam, breaking open the fuselage. Somehow, miraculously, pockets of survivors remained, burned, bloodied, but alive. The captain was found still strapped into his seat, hands frozen on the controls. Investigators would later find that the engine's internal fuel line had fractured mid-flight, igniting a fire that destroyed the right wing's hydraulics and compromised its structure. The alarm that had first sounded in the cockpit had been the only warning. The moment they heard it, the fate of Flight 718 was sealed. The wreckage of Flight 718 burned deep into the night. By the time dawn rose over the coastline, a heavy fog had settled, blurring the outlines of the twisted fuselage scattered across the sand. Rescue crews had worked through darkness, their floodlights cutting cones through smoke as firefighters fought to cool what remained of the right wing. The acrid scent of burning fuel still hung thick in the air. Among the responders, silence replaced shouting. The kind of quiet that comes after everything that could be done has already been done. In the control tower, the men and women who had guided the jet's final moments stood motionless, their headsets hanging limp around their neck. They had watched the blip fade from radar and reappear as a pulsing heat signature on the shoreline. Impact confirmed, someone had whispered, and that single phrase had frozen the room. Now, hours later, they watched the smoke from the coastline rise into the gray sky like a signal no one wanted to see. At first light, investigators from the Transportation Safety Board arrived, stepping through mud and debris with the grim precision of surgeons. The forward section of the fuselage lay cracked open like a shell, the cockpit crushed but intact enough to reveal its final moment. Captain Reynolds was still there, slumped forward with his hands locked around the yoke. Beside him, First Officer Hayes was twisted against his seat, his oxygen mask fused to melted wiring. The fire had eaten nearly everything, yet somehow the cockpit voice recorder, a small black cylinder lodged behind the captain's seat, had survived. An engineer retrieved it gently, his gloves leaving smudges of soot across its bright orange surface. "This," he murmured, "will tell us how it happened." By midday, journalists had begun to gather beyond the barricades. They spoke in hushed tones about miracles and tragedies, about the handful of survivors pulled from the wreckage, dazed and trembling, and about the families waiting in sterile airport halls for names that would never be called again. Inside the hangar where the recorders were taken, a team of analysts sat in a soundproof room, headphones pressed tight, as the tape began to play. The first few minutes were routine. Calm voices, checklists, laughter about the weather. Then came the alarms, the same piercing tones that had echoed through the cockpit. The analysts flinched as they heard them, their notes trembling. Through the static came the captain's voice. Steady, professional. "We've got a fire indication. Right engine, confirm visual." Hayes's voice followed, strained but clear. "Confirmed flame. Pulling handle." Then the sound of switches, the hiss of extinguishers. A pause. And then the tone again, shrill, relentless. The analysts sat frozen as the voices quickened. "She's not responding. We're losing hydraulics. We'll have to ditch." Static swallowed part of the recording, replaced by deep, rhythmic breathing, oxygen masked. And finally, just before the impact, the captain's last words. "Hold her steady, we're not done yet." In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the fragments of Flight 718's final journey. They found a thin trail of scorched metal stretching across 3 miles of sea, marking where the right engine had exploded mid-descent. Metallurgical analysis revealed microscopic fatigue cracks along the fuel line, a defect that had gone undetected during maintenance. Once the line fractured, raw fuel sprayed into the engine bay, igniting instantly. The fire spread through the hydraulic manifolds and electrical conduits, severing both control systems and communications. The pilots had been flying blind, fighting a fire that could never be extinguished. The official report, released months later, was clinical in tone but devastating in implication. A cascading system's failure initiated by an undetected structural fatigue crack led to a sustained in-flight fire, subsequent loss of control, and collision with terrain. Beneath those words lay the human truth. The choices, the courage, the voices that had fought until there was nothing left to save. At the memorial service held on the bluffs overlooking the crash site, families gathered under a gray sky. A single bell tolled for each name read aloud. Among the mourners was a young flight attendant who had survived by sheer chance, thrown clear when the fuselage split. Her arms were bandaged, her face pale, but she stood straight as the wind pulled at her hair. "He never gave up," she whispered to a reporter afterward. "The captain. I saw him fighting the controls until the end. He said, 'We're going home,' even when we all knew we weren't." In the hangar where the wreckage was stored, engineers continued to study the remains, tracing every line of damage. Each twisted cable told a story of pressure and heat, of seconds that stretched into eternity. Boeing sent teams to examine design flaws. Airlines revised maintenance schedules. Regulators updated inspection protocols for aging jet. Every lesson learned came too late for Flight 718, but it changed the future for those who would take to the skies after. Late one evening, after the hangar had emptied, one investigator stayed behind. He stood beside what was left of the cockpit, looking at the blackened panels. The sunlight through the cracked ceiling cast gold over the metal. He imagined the final moments, the smoke, the heat, the captain's steady hands, and felt a deep, silent respect. "You almost made it," he said quietly. When the final report was released to the public, a small plaque was added beside the memorial overlooking the sea. It bore no dates or details, only a single line from the cockpit voice recorder, etched into steel. "Hold her steady, we're not done yet." In the weeks that followed, the wreckage of Flight 718 was cleared piece by piece, but the echoes of that flight refused to fade. The coastline bore the scars of the impact, a long, scorched trench carved into the earth where the fuselage had broken apart, and beyond it, the restless sea that had swallowed so much of the aircraft's debris. Locals said the waves still carried the faint smell of jet fuel, and fishermen swore they could hear something at night, the faint hum of engines drifting through the fog. For the families of those lost, the sound became something between myth and mourning. Survivors were taken to nearby hospitals, their names whispered in crowded waiting rooms by reporters and relatives desperate for news. Out of 203 souls, 37 survived. Many were badly burned or broken, their lungs scarred by smoke, their skin etched with the memory of fire. Yet every one of them told the same story. The calm voice of Captain Reynolds, the steady hands of his crew, and the impossible feeling that they were being guided by something greater than luck. "He wouldn't give up," one survivor said softly from his hospital bed, eyes unfocused. "The plane was falling apart, but he was still talking to us, still trying." First Officer Daniel Hayes's body was found still belted in his seat, his hand locked around the throttle. When investigators pried his fingers free, they discovered that, even as the right wing burned away, he had been pushing for thrust, fighting for lift until the last second. His mother, interviewed days later, said through tears, "He used to say that a pilot's job wasn't just flying, it was keeping hope alive when no one else could." In the small towns scattered along the coast, strangers lit candles in their windows. Vigils were held in community halls where people who had never met the passengers stood shoulder to shoulder, listening to the names being read aloud. Some had found debris on the beaches: seat cushions, torn life vests, a child's toy airplane melted nearly smooth. They laid them at the base of the memorial plaque where the captain's final words were engraved. The waves crashed softly below, and for a long while, no one spoke. Inside the airline's headquarters, executives gathered in silence as the final accident report arrived. The CEO, his voice hoarse, read aloud the final paragraph. The crew's actions, though ultimately unsuccessful in preventing the crash, displayed exceptional airmanship and composure under catastrophic failure. Their decisions likely saved dozens of lives. There was no applause, no relief, only grief mixed with pride. The report was placed on the table, and no one left the room for a long time. But while official voices spoke of data and mechanics, others carried the story differently. A journalist from a small aviation magazine wrote an article titled, "The Last Flight of the Human Spirit." It began simply, "When the alarm sounded, they didn't run. They fought for everyone behind them." The article spread quietly across the world, shared by pilots, flight attendants, and passengers alike. It reminded people that, behind every cockpit door, there were not just professionals, but human beings bound by duty and courage. Months passed. The survivors slowly began to heal, though none walked away unchanged. One of them, a flight attendant named Claire Jennings, who had been thrown from the fuselage during impact, began visiting schools to speak about courage in crisis. "I don't remember the fire," she would say to the children, "only the captain's voice. He told us we were going home. And even though we didn't, I believed him until the end." Her words carried far beyond the classroom. Meanwhile, aviation engineers worked tirelessly to ensure no other crew would ever face what Reynolds and Hayes did. New maintenance directives were issued, mandating ultrasonic testing for all fuel lines on Boeing 757s worldwide. Airlines quietly overhauled inspection procedures. Pilots across the industry began sharing the Flight 718 recording in training sessions, not as a lesson in failure, but as a testament to composure under chaos. The phrase, "Reynolds calm," became part of their vernacular, a shorthand for doing one's duty when everything else collapses. Years later, a monument was built near the crash site, a curved wall of brushed metal inscribed with the names of every passenger and crew member. The design mirrored the shape of a wing, its tip pointing skyward toward the flight path that had carried them home for the last time. Beneath it, a small plaque bore a single inscription: "They did not fall, they flew." On the first anniversary, the families gathered again. The air was cold and still. The surviving crew members placed flowers beneath the plaque and stood in silence as a single aircraft, another Boeing 757, flew overhead, its engines humming like a promise. When it passed, the sound lingered, echoing across the cliff. The years softened the pain, but the story never disappeared. 4 pilots, Flight 718 became a ghost flight, a reminder of what it means to fight the impossible. For the world, it became a symbol of quiet heroism, of voices steady in the face of catastrophe. In one corner of an aviation museum, the cockpit voice recorder sits encased in glass. Its once bright orange paint has faded with time, its surface scorched and dented. Visitors often lean in close to read the small brass plaque below it. The inscription is simple. When they heard the alarm, it was already too late, but they never stopped fighting. 20 years passed, and the world moved on, as it always does. But the story of Flight 718 never really faded. It lingered in the halls of flight schools, whispered in simulators when new trainees first learned the sound of the master warning alarm. It lived in the quiet reverence of memorial ceremonies and the distant echo of jet engines that crossed the same skies where Captain Reynolds and First Officer Hayes had fought for their lives. The ocean had long since reclaimed the scars along the coastline, but every pilot who flew over that stretch of water still looked down, just for a second, out of respect. Among them was a young pilot named Evan Reynolds, the captain's son. He had been 12 years old when the plane went down, too young to understand why his father never came home, but old enough to remember the knock on the door and his mother's silence afterward. 4 years, he had sworn he'd never fly. But the pull of the sky, the same one that had called to his father, was stronger than grief. By the time he was 30, he had earned his wings and joined the same airline his father once flew for. When he walked into the training hangar for the first time, the instructor handed him a manual stamped with a familiar logo: Flight Safety Systems, Boeing 757/767. He smiled faintly, tracing the embossed lettering. "Seems like fate," he murmured. His first command was set for a routine coastal flight, the same route, by coincidence, that his father's ill-fated journey had taken. He didn't believe in omens, but that morning as the sun climbed over the horizon, something inside him stirred. He stood by the aircraft, a new generation 757 with upgraded fire suppression systems, stronger fuel lines and double-redundant hydraulics, changes made because of Flight 718. As he ran his hand along the smooth metal fuselage, he whispered softly, "We fixed what you couldn't." The passengers boarded in an easy rhythm, unaware of the history carried in the name stenciled beneath the cockpit window, Spirit of 718. Evan had requested it himself. When questioned by the airline, he said, "It's not for the tragedy, it's for the people who kept fighting." As the engines spooled up, the deep, rhythmic hum filled the cabin. Evan settled into the left seat, fingers brushing the yoke. His first officer, a young woman named Alicia Porter, noticed the faint tremor in his hands. "You all right, Captain?" she asked with a smile. He nodded slowly. "Just remembering." She tilted her head. "You mean Flight 718, don't you?" He looked at her, surprised. "You know the story?" "Everyone does," she said. "Every pilot studies it. Your father's voice is on the training tapes we still use." The captain's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. "Then let's make him proud." The aircraft taxied to the runway, engines roaring with steady confidence. As the tower cleared them for takeoff, Evan looked out over the ocean glinting beyond the runway and thought of his father, of that final, haunting alarm, of the man who had fought the impossible to give others a chance. "Here we go," he said softly. "Cleared for departure." The plane accelerated, its nose lifting smoothly into the morning air, and within minutes they were climbing through soft, white clouds. At 35,000 feet, the world was still. The sky stretched endlessly above, the ocean below, and sunlight glinted off the wings like liquid gold. Evan leaned back, scanning the panels. Modern instruments glowed quietly in green and blue, stable, perfect. But as he exhaled, a sound pierced the calm, a single, sharp tone. The master caution alarm. For a moment, his heart stopped. The sound was unmistakable, the same one that had once sealed his father's fate. The same tone from the black box recording he'd listened to 100 times. His hands froze above the controls, the air around him suddenly heavy. Alicia looked up, startled. "Caution light, hydraulic pump B, low pressure." The exact words his father had said decades ago. Evan swallowed hard, every muscle tense. Then, almost by instinct, he reached forward and flipped the switch to engage the auxiliary pump. The light blinked once and went dark. Silence returned. The alarm was gone. Alicia exhaled. "Backup engaged." "False reading, maybe?" Evan stared at the panel for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe. But we'll keep an eye on it." For several minutes, he sat there in silence, his pulse still hammering. The sound of that alarm had carried him back, into his father's cockpit, into the smoke, the chaos, the fight to keep an aircraft alive when everything was already lost. He realized then what every pilot who had studied Flight 718 had eventually learned. It wasn't just about systems or procedures. It was about resolve. About holding steady when fear takes over. He reached for the radio, switching to the company frequency. "This is Spirit of 718, reporting minor hydraulic anomaly. Resolved via backup system. Continuing flight path." The dispatcher acknowledged calmly, unaware of the storm inside the captain's heart. Hours later, the aircraft began its descent toward its destination. The sun was setting over the same sea that had claimed the original flight so many years before. The golden reflection stretched across the waves like a path leading home. Evan looked out over it, and something shifted inside him, a strange peace, a quiet realization that maybe his father wasn't gone at all. Maybe he was right there, in the hum of the engines, in the steady vibration of the controls, in the silence after the alarm. When they touched down, the landing was smooth, perfect. The tires kissed the runway, the engines reversed with a controlled roar, and for a moment, everything seemed to breathe again. As the plane taxied to the gate, Alicia turned and said softly, "That was beautiful, Captain." Evan smiled faintly. He would have liked that one. Later that evening, as passengers disembarked and the cabin lights dimmed, Evan remained alone in the cockpit. The last rays of sunset glowed through the windshield, painting the controls in amber light. He reached into his flight bag and pulled out an old photograph. His father in uniform, standing beside the Boeing 757 that had never made it home. He placed it on the dash, just above the throttle quadrant. "You did it," he whispered. "You saved them. And because of you, no one will ever die that way again." He sat in silence for a while, the hum of cooling systems filling the air. Then, faintly, from deep within the plane, a sound flickered, an almost imperceptible tone, brief and soft. It was the same frequency as that terrible alarm, but gentler now, almost like a heartbeat. Evan froze, listening. It faded quickly, replaced by quiet wind against the fuselage. He smiled, eyes glistening. "I hear you, Dad," he said softly. "Loud and clear." Outside, the stars were beginning to appear, one by one, across the darkening sky. The same stars his father had flown beneath. The same sky that had watched over both their journeys. The one that had ended in fire, and the one that ended in peace. The alarm that once signaled death had, in that moment, become something else entirely. A bridge between two generations, between fear and faith, between an ending and a beginning. As the night deepened and the airfield lights blinked below, Evan stood, turned off the cockpit power, and looked one last time through the windshield at the world beyond. "Hold her steady," he whispered, echoing the last words ever recorded from his father's flight. "We're not done yet." He walked out into the quiet terminal, the hum of the engines still lingering in his mind, and for the first time since he was a boy, he felt free. The legacy of Flight 718 had finally come full circle, not as a story of loss, but as one of endurance, courage, and the unbreakable connection between those who fly and those who came before. Thank you for watching this Mayday special. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real aviation documentaries, stories that honor courage, humanity, and the skies that test them both. Fly safe, and remember, even in silence, some echoes never die.